Now, I know you started writing in your 30s after Trayvon Martin was killed. Really, that's when you jumped into this. And to start writing, you had to foundationally already secretly be, writing somewhere. What was it about the Trayvon Martin killing and then the subsequent acquittal of the Cretan George Zimmerman that brought you to the pen?
It was really after, living my entire life kind of in liberal Seattle, this kind of white majority space that believed that it does everything right because they check a certain box in election time and everyone recycles. Realizing that in this space and time where I was grieving and scared and heartbroken and angry, that people around me weren't, and trying to figure out what that gap is and what stops white America, especially progressive white America, from understanding and from feeling the same outrage. And, this was before the phrase Black Lives Matter had been popularized. And so there was this dissonance between what liberal white Seattle got credit for as far as being anti-racist and what it was actually willing to do. So I started writing really for my own self-preservation, because I had to figure out, I had to find a way to understand why people weren't getting it and try to get people to start engaging on these topics, because I wanted to feel safe where I lived, and I want my kids to feel safe, and I want my, other Black people in our community to feel safe. And so that's really what it was for me, was trying to find a way to communicate why this matters and what it feels like to be a Black woman living in spaces that likes to pretend like race isn't an issue, and when it most definitely is.
And in fact, the term Black Lives Matter was born out of the travesty of the taking a life of that 17-year-old and then the acquittal, because I think many of us were stunned. I remember, I was like, surely after Tamir Rice, surely after a 12-year-old, like Mike Brown, you can say, okay, Eric Garner, he had some run-ins before, but a 12-year-old playing with a toy gun in an open carry state is gunned down in 3 seconds. Surely America is going to be outraged by that. Surely. And it didn't happen. And then you start to realize, man, we really do live in two Americas where somebody could look at the exact same thing. I mean, but we saw it before that with Rodney King, right? So let me take it all the way back. Surely we watched the police beat the brakes off of Rodney King. Surely they're going to be found guilty. Surely people are going to be outraged by this. This man's face looked like, like a dog attacked him. And then they were acquitted. And it was okay. It wasn't until OJ that I realized that we really lived in two Americas, because I remember running around the New York Daily News like I had won the sweepstakes or something, like I'd hit the lotto when they said not guilty. And not because I liked OJ, I thought he was trash, but that for the first time in my lived history that a Black man got off. And I saw white women huddled and crying. Sina and Ijeoma holding each other, looking at me like I was crazy. And I thought everyone would have the same reaction that I did.
Like OJ was going to come after them?
I don't know. No, but they were upset, boy. And I was like, what? I was in my 20s or something. I was like, this is weird. Why aren't they feeling what I'm feeling? So we live in two Americas. Your book, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. Why'd you start with white male America? Because 55% of white women are problematic. I'm just going to say it, put it out there.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the full title is Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. And I think that it's important to recognize, because what we're looking at is that phenomenon of the people we choose to lead us. And so that's something that a lot of people are indicted in that phenomenon. It's about how we consistently say that, this is serious. I can swear on here, right? Yes. Okay. So like these,
we just had a whole episode. We had a whole episode about Kegels and farts before you got here. So there you go.
So, like the idea that we should be led by these incompetent, shitty, violent, oppressive white men is a concept. It's an idea that we're all complicit in, some more than others, right? So what I wanted to look at was the power structure, that identity that we all play a part in, and within it, recognize who's upholding this. And so white women, where white women have been extreme oppressors, have been violent in our history, especially around race, has been where they have tied their future to white male power, right? Where they have decided to call in white male power to defend them, to give them their own relative power. And so they play a part in it, but it's all upholding this system of white male supremacy, right? So it's where white women have decided this is the closest I'm going to get to power, is by leaning into white male violence. I'm going to call the police, who are, the armed faction of white male supremacy in America. I'm going to do these things to give myself more power, to make, to center myself where I can. And so that's what I wanted to look at, was the structure itself. And hopefully readers will see where, oh shit, I played a part of this. I've been upholding this as well, and start to break away from those harmful patterns.
Who is the most mediocre in your book? Who is the king of the mediocres?
It's so hard. There's so many.
It's like, what's your favorite movie?
Right. Yeah. There's so many mediocre white men throughout the book that you're just sitting there like, oh, wow. Some of the ones where it's like,
and how far back did you go, by the way?
So we went back to Buffalo Bill is about where.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So we've covered some ground. A mediocre white man. George Preston Marshall probably is one of the most mediocre. So he was the founder of the Washington Skins, that racial slur name.
Oh, right.
And the way in which he clung to his refusal to desegregate his team, even when it was costing him wins, even when white sportscasters were mocking him because he was like allergic to winning, because he didn't want to admit that Black football players maybe could win some games. And if he, and then of course, when he was forced to bring in Black players, he had a stroke and died. And I like to think that that's what did it.
I'm sorry.
That was.
I should laugh at that.
So, that to me stands out as one of the stories where it's like, oh man, you committed yourself to a crappy failing team because you loved racism so much, and it actually maybe killed you when you were forced to step away from it. And he even put in his will that none of the money in his will could be used towards desegregation. Imagine being that committed to something where you're like, even when I die,
Okay, so tell me about Buffalo Bill Cody. Why was he number one? Why did he come first?
Buffalo Bill was real? That was a real person?
No, I don't think so. Was he?
Yeah, he's a real guy. Yeah, he's a real guy. And Cody, Wyoming is named after him. He's considered one of the founders of the city, Cody, Wyoming.
Huh.
He was a real person. So I knew that was probably a chapter I knew from the beginning of the book was going to be in the book. When I stumbled upon the Buffalo Bill Museum, which is a whole city block museum dedicated to the legacy of this dude, and walked in and saw their Zulu warrior exhibit, where they had Zulu warriors that would travel with this, which was the most popular show in the world in its time.
Wait, pause. Yeah. What is it like? Because I know they had human zoos in America and in France and in other places. But why would they have a Zulu warriors are not, they're not, this is not the country where a Zulu warrior would be even captured.
Yeah. So it's definitely, it's a fascinating, way, but yeah, it started out, Buffalo Bill was one of those guys, William Cody was one of those guys who had 10 careers, but really wanted to be an actor. But he would do at the time, which was engage in white male violence, of joining these militias to help force Native populations off their land. And he became famous because he was known for slaughtering buffalo, which was a way to control Native populations. It was a tool of genocide to get rid of their food source. And so he was named the Buffalo Bill by bragging about killing thousands of buffalo for sport. That's where the name came from. So this is a guy that the whole West, the whole generations of, especially in the 50s and 60s, of young white men, basically from his time through the 60s and 70s, wanted to be like. And so then he started a stage show, and his first prop was the actual scalp of a Native individual that he had killed in battle that he would pull on stage. But from then the show grew, and he wanted it to be a history show, a living history. And he would have his Zulu warriors that would come in. Sometimes there would be like pardon deals made with captured Native leaders saying, if you participate in the show and ride around on a horse in a full headdress, then you won't be on the reservation or you won't be in jail. And so it was this show that was the most popular show on earth, made him incredibly wealthy, contributed to a lot of violent stereotypes about Native people and other people of color, contributed directly to the mass genocide of the buffalo population in this country. And he has whole cities throughout the West named after him, whole city block museums named after him, and he helped shape an entire generation of white manhood. And he's thought of today, like you'll read articles that say he was a friend of the Indian, that he was a conservationist, that he was a feminist. And his legacy, what he actually was incredibly violent and mediocre. And, half of his legacy was built on lies, and stories he would make up about himself. But it's how we define white manhood throughout the West.
Isn't that American, though? We're talking about Ijeoma Oluo, and her book is called Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. I've been talking about this from George Washington all the way through. This country's built on hypocrisy, lies, mythology, and this creation of whiteness, which was just simply to create a power structure where they always stay in power. It's genius at the same time. At the same time as it's mediocre to build a fake construct called whiteness and blackness, to create race, to stay, and it has worked. It has worked. So who's reading this book? Because if you're a mediocre ass white person right now, you're not trying to change the narrative. Ijeoma, that you don't want to admit to this. You're not going to buy into this. So who's this book for?
I've had to build a writing career with no desire whatsoever to have white men read my book. Like, that's something I have to throw out the window right away, right? Where I start aiming and going, what can I do to get white men to read this? I've lost the plot. Absolutely. I know some will, but that'll be a bonus, right? Because I do hear from some white men who feel trapped, who feel very much like, hey, this deal isn't working out for me the way it was supposed to. I don't feel, like I'm going to be as powerful or successful as was promised to me. What do I need to do? But for me, that's not my goal. My goal is that there's a whole hell of a lot of people who know something's wrong. And there aren't actually enough white men in this country to uphold white male supremacy on their own. If we all stopped participating in it and said, this is unacceptable, we want something better, we could actually make some real systemic change that can help everyone. And that's what I want people to recognize. So I want people to read this history and say, oh, okay, this is a pattern. And this is a pattern that I've been subjected to, that I have the right to demand change. But it's also a pattern I've participated in where I needed to change in my communities and in myself. And that's what I want people to see. So, for people of color, I want this to counteract the gaslighting that tells us that this isn't really happening, that it's not a pattern, that it's all individual actions. If something bad happens to you, it's because you did a bad thing. And instead, no, this is a system we've built. But I also want maybe white women who understand something's wrong to say, oh, this is actually a system I play a part in as well. I don't get to just say, yeah, white men suck. Like, I'm not connected to white men. I don't get to act like, we're separate. And liberal areas like where I live in Seattle don't get to say, well, we vote Democrats and we're not a part of the problem. I want people to understand that this is a pattern of history that's not defined to one particular area, not defined to one particular political ideology. And we have to be really conscious and make a real effort to break away from it. But that means we have to know what it looks like.
866-801-8255. As you're talking, I'm grateful because I think we've been woefully miseducated on purpose. So that's part of the other flip to this, is that our school system codifies the mediocrity. We learned all about these mediocre people and we put them on pedestals. We have monuments to them. We have statues. We have holidays. And so we grow up believing in Santa Claus, in the form of our leaders. The hardest thing, I was just having this conversation today, is to, everything that you believe is wrong is to admit that. That's one of the hardest things. It's like, now what do I do with all of this? I've learned this and I know it for the last 40 years, 50 years. What do I do with this? How do I rethink the things that I've been taught?
Mm-hmm. And I think that that is something where I think right now white America is caught in a lot of fear, right? To realize that you've sold out your community, your friends, you've sold out human beings and your own ideals for this reward that was never coming to you, for this belief that, in an ideal that never existed. That's got to be incredibly painful. And I think, the older we get and the more we've built our lives around it, the more harmful that can be. And I'd say that's harmful in every community, but I'd say right now, the white community, the pain, the pushback we're seeing right now, and seeing what the Trump administration saying that we're not allowed to talk about systemic racism, it's to avoid that, right? That knowledge that, oh, the system was unfair, and not just unfair to populations of color, but like that white men have been screwing themselves over by signing on to this system as well. And that is something, I call white supremacy a pyramid scheme because that's how it acts, right? It gets people to sign in saying that their payday's coming. It's never going to come. And boy, are you going to be embarrassed when you figure that out. That's going to really have you questioning a lot about yourself that you may not want to question. But we got to get used to that. We have to do that work because it's going to hit us one way or the other. And how sad would it be to never realize it? That you've been conned, to live your whole life just think, oh, one day this whole white manhood thing is going to really, I'm going to be a king one day. And you're not going to be a king. What you're going to do is just participate in brutality and violence and then die. And so I would rather we figure this out and separate from it, even if it's painful, than live our whole lives in ignorance and hurting each other because we don't want to admit it.
I'm really happy that you brought up the pyramid scheme, because that was actually going to be my question is like, what is, and shameless plug, I run a podcast called Fraudsters, and we're actually going to do one on David Duke, who is a fraudster, right? And he's actually defrauding white people of thinking that there is some sort of supremacy there and just taking their money. In the history, or in the kind of mediocre white men that you wrote about, what was the mechanism that they used to elevate themselves? Was there a common thread that you found that connected a lot of them?
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of what I found was there was this creation of the myth of the other who was subjugating or harming white men and stopping them from achieving what they were meant to have, right? So we saw this we saw this in the Dust Bowl, right? This mythology, we saw this post-Civil War, this mythology of the Southern white man who had been harmed, right? The story of the Okie who had been shat upon, and then we see this throughout history. We see this in tech and the white dudes who have this mythology that they created tech because they were the outcasts and, this is their free space that they've created, right? We see this throughout the country, and that myth is your excuse for why white manhood isn't paying off, right? And you not only are exempt from looking at what you've done wrong, exempt from looking at how corrupt the system actually is, you also have a vent and outlet for your anger, which ends up being women and people of color. Mm-hmm. And you get to blame them instead. Because the only other alternatives when we tell white men that you were born deserving greatness, when we tell them all you have to do is be white and men, and that's what we say, right? That's the whole ideal behind Make America Great Again. Is we'll go back to where you don't have to do anything and you're going to be middle class and have a wife and have 2 kids. Never existed for a lot of people, by the way. Never existed for a lot of white men. But when that doesn't pan out and all you were supposed to do was be born deserving, then that means it didn't pan out because either someone took it from you or something is wrong with you. And I think it's no coincidence that we see the violence of white male mediocrity either be turned on populations of color and women or on themselves in incredibly high suicide rates in white men. And what is promised by these, populists who come in spewing this hate is a way for it to not be you. To say, it's not this system, it's not what you've bought into, it's this person. And we can solve it and get back to where, get you back on track towards fulfilling your potential of being the next great white male leader. And that was never going to happen at all. And it's just someone coming to really steal the political capital from your anger and dissatisfaction for their own benefit, and they're really being scammed.
I cannot wait to read this book. I'm so excited.
It sounds.
Gotta have you on the show. Oh my God.
The history alone. History alone. As you're talking, Ijeoma, I'm also, I've been saying on this show, I want to not focus on racism and race. I would love to not talk about that. There's so many other things that we need to focus on. And I think in many ways, not that it's a distraction, because if there's a knee on your neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, it's murder. If you're being pulled over for a taillight and you end up dead, it's murder. You know, if you're incarcerated without charges for 3 years and then let out at 16, you know, you're now 19, you kill yourself, it's murder. The deleterious effects of racism are palpable. We know what that is. But I'm just trying to figure out how we can build around it. You know, like you said, if we all agreed, because anti-Blackness lives in Black people, you know, we're built, it's, 400 years of being indoctrinated about your own hate, your own lack of worth is powerful. How do we get to a place where we can, put up the stiff arm against this and build around it, build the kind of world we want to live in, and not even have to consider the mediocrity when so many of our livelihoods are held in the hands of these people who are mediocre as F.
Mm-hmm.
Said it. Absolutely.
And I think that that's something where it's important. I think that we have so much work to do in understanding the issue of white supremacy and white male supremacy in this country and fighting it, but it has to be fought in different ways in different populations. And the idea that, like, the Black population in particular is the population that's supposed to defeat white supremacy is an idea that needs to die, right? Mm-hmm. We need to understand it so that we know where we are and we can do the work in our communities and our healing and to fight where it has, gotten its hooks in us. But whiteness has to do its own work as well, and has to really do the powerful work of figuring out what it wants whiteness to be and whether it wants to continue on this suicidal path that it's on. Mm-hmm. And so the question I always want to ask myself is, what would Blackness in America be if white male supremacy disappeared? And that's a question I don't think we're ready to answer right now, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a question we need to ask. What would we be if we weren't constantly in reaction, if we weren't constantly adjusting to these constraints? Because we can't set goals based on the constraints we're in. We have to be able to imagine something free from that and something greater. But that also means we have to see what it looks like. And so part of what my writing is for this particular book is that part. This is what it looks like. But the rest, the imagination, like, I'm looking at, writers like Nora Jemison, right? Like people who are saying, what are the alternate futures we could have? And I want us all to get and save time and prioritize that practice. What would it look like to be free from this? Not just what would it look like to not have this boot on our neck, but what would it look like to build ourselves up in our own image? What would it look like? What would our systems look like if we could build them from scratch and no one had ever told us it had to be this way? Those are the questions I think we need to start asking and prioritizing, because no one's going to ask that for us. And if we defeat white supremacy and we're crushed under it, or we have nowhere to go from there, did we actually defeat white supremacy? That's the thing that I think we need to look at.
Wow. Well, it looks like Wakanda, which is why I think so many of us definitely embrace that. And every time somebody calls up and says, I'm a white man, I said, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be white? I can't get a good answer. Mm-hmm. And I think if you identify as white and you can't answer that, what's white culture? And if you can't answer that outside of the framework of racism, mm-hmm. Well, it's Confederate flags and it's, if it's that, what is it? Then how do you identify with something that you can't even define?
And how are you going to change it? If you don't have a goal, you don't know what it is, how are you going to make it better?